Okay, good. So my name is Hailin, and today I'm gonna present our work on information locality in the processing of English object-relative clauses. So this is a collaborative work with Weijie and Richard Futrell at UC Irvine, and Hahn at Hailin. So we start with a very broad question: how can we categorize the incremental processing difficulty of a word? Like another way to frame this question is how we can understand the cognitive mechanisms underlying the incremental sentence processing. And there are two broad accounts that aim to answer this question, those based on expectations and those based on working memory constraints. I'll start with the expectation-based theories. So according to this group of theory, like surprisal theory, words with low contextual probability or high surprisal should be more difficult to process. I know this is the third time that you guys have heard this today, so I'm just reinforcing it at this point. So when a word has high contextual probability, an optimal processor should have already done some of the processing work before the current word is actually encountered. So when you actually encounter the word at a later stage, the processing cost should be lower. Let's look at two examples. So in the upper example, we have the doctor who is living in downtown cure the patient. So here, the contextual probability of the verb cured should be very high, given the preceding context. In contrast, in the lower example, the word scolded has a much lower contextual probability. I mean, you can get this measure from like n-gram models or neural language models. And according to expectation-based theories, this difference in the contextual probability should actually make the upper example easier to process. On the other hand, the processor also has to deal with limited working memory resources. So according to this group of accounts, the longer a dependency is, the harder it is to process. And we usually call this locality effects. So the idea is that when you have to connect the current word with something that came up much earlier in the sentence, the earlier word might have undergone either decay or interference. Then when you retrieve it, it's going to incur processing difficulty. Let's look at two examples again. So in the upper one, retrieving the subject doctor at the verb cured should be very easy because the dependency is very short. It's actually just there, it's local. But in the lower example, the subject doctor and the verb cured are separated by a relative clause, making the retrieval of the subject at the verb cured more challenging. So according to memory-based accounts, processing should be more difficult in those long-distance cases. All right, let's go back to this diagram showing the two types of accounts. As a matter of fact, both expectation-based and memory-based accounts have received a lot of empirical support. But more recently, another line of research has been working towards a more unified account, one that combines both expectation-based and also working memory-based mechanisms. And we will be focusing on one representative example, which is lossy context appraisal. And in the current work, we will empirically test the predictions of lossy context appraisal using English object-extracted relative clauses. Here's a quick roadmap for today's talk. We'll start with an introduction with lossy context appraisal, and here we come. So the core idea behind this theory is that our expectations for upcoming material are generated based on a noisy or imperfect, distorted memory representations. We can call it R, based on the context. And this distortion is modeled as erasure noise for each word stored in memory. The longer a word is retained in memory, the more likely it will get deleted and erased. We will discuss this in more detail later. So this is distinct from the standard surprisal theory, which assumes that expectations are built from the veridical context C. So LCS, or lossy context appraisal, can capture a wide range of effects, including expectation-based effects, since contextual probability still plays a central role in shaping predictions. It also accounts for working memory effects because words that were seen earlier may have been forgotten or erased, and when you need to retrieve it at a later point, it will incur processing difficulty. And most importantly, lossy context appraisal also predict an interaction between the expectation-based and working memory-based mechanisms in what's called information locality. So the idea is that if a word earlier in the sentence strongly predicts the current word, the expectation benefit might actually be weakened because the earlier word may not have been perfectly retained in memory. So you can't really use it for predictions anymore. And in the next slide, I will try to formally derive information locality. Now let's look at standard surprisal first. So we can actually view the contextual surprisal of a word as its unigram surprisal minus its point-wise mutual information with the context. So the PMI here is calculated as the logarithm of the joint frequency of the current word and the context divided by the product of their individual frequencies. It basically tells us how much the context, seeing the context will make us predict the upcoming word. Okay. I'll try to visualize this with this figure. So the full area here represents the unigram surprisal of the word scolded. We can also think of it as the information content of the word. So the contextual surprisal of scolded, given the context, is represented as the gray area in the top panel. And it basically is the unigram surprisal minus its PMI with the context, which is the pink area. What will happen if the current word has higher PMI with the context? If we replace the current word with cured, its PMI with the context should be higher. So the contextual surprisal of cured should actually be squeezed smaller. There's less surprise because the context actually already gives you a lot of information, or you have already done a lot of work before you encounter the critical word. Okay. So this is still surprisal, but one point is that estimating the co-occurrence statistics of a word with its entire context can be very challenging. So instead of calculating a PMI between the current word and the full context all at once, in this equation, we actually break down the context and replace it with the sum over the PMI between the current word and each individual word in the preceding context. I hope this makes sense, and we can visually represent this in this figure. So the pink area now represents the sum of the PMI values between the current word and each word in the preceding context. So here we have the scolded, we have the PMI between the scolded and we have the PMI between scolded and the doctor. Once we replace the current word with cured, as you can see, because the PMI between the current word cured and doctor should have higher PMI compared to the previous case, the overall contextual surprisal of the current word cured should actually be lower. Now let's see what the lossy context is doing here. We'll introduce lossy context surprisal here. So this is where we add a progressive noise term called E. So basically this noise term, we can also call it erasure rates. It modifies the magnitude of the PMI between the current word and each past word. Every word stored in memory will get assigned a noise term, and it gets larger and larger if the word is stored in memory for longer. So this is how we model locality effects. So if a word is stored in memory longer, its erasure rates will get higher. Effectively, this will reduce its PMI with the current word. Let's illustrate in this graph again. So this is the standard surprisal theory, where we have very high mutual information between cured and doctor. But once we introduce the noise progressive term, all the PMI values should get squeezed down. And importantly, earlier words are squeezed more than recent words. So this is how this theory formally derives information locality. So even if you have a word in the prior context that highly predict the current word, if it's erased, it's no use, basically. Okay, now let's jump to our experimental design. So we use very simple object extracted relative clauses in English, like this one on the screen, as our testing ground. So this structure is very useful here because prior work has shown that such structure, at least in English, places a very high working memory demand on processing. And in particular, the dependency that we're interested in is the direct object verb dependency between the matrix subject long and the RC internal verb mode. And this example, we have a high PMI between the two codependents. We can then create a low PMI condition by replacing mode with a word like watched. Still plausible, but way less likely. And we normed PMI using dependency parses from the British National Corpus. Basically, now we have two examples for the short distance conditions. And we can create two long distance conditions by inserting a relative clause that modifies the that modifies the RC internal subject. Therefore, we now have a 2x2 design fully crossed. We will spell out the predictions of loss sequence expresso in the next slide. Okay, let's look at the short distance conditions first. So if the PMI between the current word and the subject is low, as on the left panel, expresso of the current word should be higher, making it harder to process than the high PMI conditions on the right panel. However, in the long distance conditions, the short subject long is stored in memory for a very long time, making it more susceptible to erasure. So even if the veridical PMI between the subject and the current word is very high, its actual impact on reducing surprisal might be very, very minimal when you hit a critical word. Therefore, both cases should be very hard to process. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and talk about our methodology. So in this work, we used the A-maze task. So in this experimental paradigm, participants choose between the correct continuation and a distractor word at each step. The distractors are generated by a language model, and they should have very low contextual probability so that the participant will not select them. In this particular paradigm, if participants make a mistake, they will be prompted so, and they can try again like with a 500 millisecond delay so that it forces them to pay attention. Otherwise, it's going to be super annoying to go through the whole experiment. So we chose this paradigm because participants have to pay attention, of course. Otherwise, you can't make the correct choices. And it also forces incremental processing and less susceptible to spilled over effects. So in this study, we have a fully crossed 2x2 design, as we were saying before. We crossed PMI, which is high and low, and distance, long and short. We have 24 items in total, plus 48 fillers, and we recruited 48 participants from Prolific who did the study online. For statistical modeling, we fitted Bayesian linear mixed effects models on log transformed RTs at the critical verb. We also included several control variables, namely the frequency and the length of the critical word, and also the surprisal at the critical word given the context, estimated from GPT-2. We included frequency and word length because, as you might have seen, the critical verbs actually differ across conditions, so we kind of add this control variable. And we also included surprisal at the critical word because in the long-distance conditions, we inserted a relative clause between the dependency, so that might actually alter the contextual probability of the critical word. So we include this as a control variable as well. Now let's see the results. So just to remind you, these are our 4 conditions, and the 2 factors are distance and PMI, and our analysis focuses on the RC internal verb. Actually, because Maze has very good localized measures, we didn't analyze any spillover regions. I'll plot the results here. So the circle represents high PMI conditions, and the triangle represents the low PMI conditions. And on the left, we have the long condition. On the right, we have the short conditions. And the results are here. Okay. So as you can see, we actually get a very, very strong locality effects. The long conditions on the left-hand side take much longer to process than the short distance conditions. As for facilitatory effects, that's what we predict, right? The facilitatory effects for PMI, as you can see in this graph, it actually is, you can actually only see it in the short distance conditions. In the long distance conditions, the long PMI and the short PMI conditions take roughly similar amount of time to process. And here we report the results of the Bayesian statistical analysis. We will report the posterior estimate for the coefficients and 95% credible interval. So first of all, we get the classical locality effects, whereby long dependency is hard to than the short dependency conditions, and the effect size is about 100 milliseconds, which is pretty big. And we also found PMI effects, high PMI leads to processing facilitation, like around 80-second reduction in processing speed. Most importantly, we get an interaction, a very positive interaction between locality and PMI, suggesting that longer distance leads to less PMI-driven facilitation. So this is consistent with the predictions of information locality. We also conducted a nested analysis. So in the short distance conditions, indeed, there is a very negative, largely negative PMI effects. But in the long distance conditions, as you can see, the effects of PMI are centered around 0. And we'll conclude our study now. So we start with a very big picture question, namely how we categorize incremental processing difficulty for words in context. And we focus on the lossy context appraisal theory, which combines both expectation-based and working memory-based accounts. And according to this theory, expectations for upcoming words are generated based on the noisy or imperfect memory representations, rather than the veridical context. We used English object relative clauses as a testing ground, and in our design, we crossed PMI and dependency length. And what we found was empirical support for information locality, whereby the PMI-driven facilitation is reduced when working memory constraints are strong. Here's our conclusion. So first of all, our findings suggest that working memory limitations can pose very strong constraints on expectation-based processes. So even if a word is highly predictable given the context, the benefit can actually disappear if the predictive context is stored in memory for too long. And second, while standard surprisal theory is very strong, it can account for many processing phenomena, it doesn't capture everything, especially in cases where working memory might play a significant role. And so we actually should be very cautious when we interpret prior work, which has found like very strong expectation-based effects, especially in the form of anti-locality, and perhaps replicate those studies like in the recent work by Apuva and Hussan 2021. And finally, future work can explore like cross-linguistic patterns, looking at how these effects play out in languages with different word order preferences to investigate how universal lossy context appraisal theory is. And finally, I would like to thank my collaborators, Weijie, who is sitting here, and also Richard, and also Michal, as well as members of USC Linguistics for their feedback on the prior version of this talk. And thank you for listening, and I hope you have robust memory representations for this talk.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. Wesley Liang from UConn. I'm wondering about the sort of emphasis on decay versus maybe something else like interference, especially with the maze task. You know, if you have more choices to make between where you get the object and what will later cue the retrieval of the object. I'm wondering if some of these alternative words in the maze could have been also potential objects for the verb. And if you have anything to say about that.
I would highly doubt it. At least, I mean, because it's like a maze means automatic. I didn't go back to check everything. Like, but at least at the noun region, the competitor shouldn't be another noun. I think I checked that at least. It is possible that word distractors in other regions might actually cause interference effects. That's actually a very interesting point. I haven't thought about that. It's actually worth looking at, like, for people interested in methodologies. But
Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, Ted Gibson, MIT.
Hi.
And very nice talk. It's a really nice
Thank you.
application of a test of the Richard Futrell's idea. So my question is about your materials for your long condition. Why did you choose a relative clause? Why not just do some prepositional phrases, or maybe look at both of these things? Why just, because I mean, my first thing would have been, that's the next thing I would do rather than going to other languages.
That's a good point. So actually, I mean, we start out with this one. This is the first project. We started with this one actually because, I mean, we were expecting that this is our best shot to actually, there is actually very strong locality effects. But actually, I think it might be interesting to have very gradient, like a locality constraints to see how that play out. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, John Robert Starr, Cornell. Thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role of context in these sentences. So, for example, there's some work, at least that I know of, in like the 80s and 90s, which says that essentially if you have a context sentence, you can facilitate like later processing. And in this case, we would expect that because that context is so far back that it would actually probably not matter much. So could you talk about the role of context in that? And like, I know you don't have a context sentence here, but like say I have something like talking about like a man, a lawn that's being observed or something by a spy. And so then therefore, that's right, watched might be faster in this case, even if it's longer and farther away.
Yeah. I think, this is at least my suspicion, when you actually have the context stored in a prior sentence, I actually think at the end of the sentence, you should actually generate some type of more efficient memory representations. So it might be less susceptible to like decay or interference at a later stage. I mean, if the dependency is within the same sentence, you're essentially still doing structure building within the same sentence. You haven't arrived yet at a efficient representation yet that you can store in your memory. So I think these two phenomena are more or less different, but I think it might be interesting to look at like how efficiently like those type of context you generated earlier, how efficiently they are stored in memory, like whether or not they are less susceptible to interference or decay. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Wesley Orth. I'm at the University of Toronto.
Thank you.
Your initial framing sort of brings up the working memory expectation divide in the work on relative clauses. And I think that comes up a lot in the sort of SRC, ORC asymmetry that we see, maybe cross-linguistically. But something that's important in sort of the expectation piece for that is a lot of the sort of expectation comes from just the relative frequency of SRCs versus ORCs. So I know you're really only looking at ORCs here. But I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how lossy context surprisal could integrate sort of the relative frequencies of SRC, ORC strategies, because this is something that varies a lot cross-linguistically. As somebody who's like looking at a language that has this freer word order in the relative clause, this could be important for seeing, can we extend this to capture the broader range of sort of different kinds of expectations we can have.
Yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think at this stage for lossy context surprisal, I think it's a bit hard to take into consideration the frequency of the whole constructions into consideration. But I think it would be nice to actually have a formal comparison between these two. And I think, there are later implementations of lossy context surprisal, like resource rational lossy context surprisal. I think there you get more freedom in like what you want to model. Here what we get is like the erasure rates, like that I have to mechanistically apply to each word in the prior context. So it's kind of like a very restrained in one sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Lisa Levinson, University of Michigan. Thank you. Super interesting. I was struck by the findings that in your study you have like more length of a distance, and you have something that seems to fade in the predictions, versus if you go back to the work on more in the argument structure domain, like Chow et al. 2016 and 2018, looking at where they propose, at least in the 2018 paper, for these cases where you have the waitress, either serving or being or some other verb, that there you find, they propose that there's a slow prediction, that certain argument structure predictions don't develop until later. So that sort of seems, the sentences have some differences, although there's actually some interesting similarities between them. But there seems to be a tension between this idea of fading predictions versus increasing predictions as you have time. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on whether that is, something about argument structure or anything else, that differences in the nature of those stimuli.
I think the biggest difference, is the methodology. I actually think when you use a maze, it should be much harder to get those delayed expectation effects, if that's what you're talking
I'll
about.
add one. So in our, I have a 2023 paper that we presented
Okay.
at HSP where we did the same thing in maze. So I didn't mention that.
Oh, really? Okay,
But
that's
we did it. So
interesting.
we see the same. You can't. It's not really. It doesn't look slow in quite the same way because
Okay.
we're not comparing N400s to P600s. But so we did find an effect, but our argument was that it was slow because maze is slow.
Yeah.
So that you're kind of slowing things down with maze anyway because of the incrementality of it. But yeah, so there's some time that you can add by adding maze, but I wonder if that's also an impact in your study that you're actually kind of adding time by doing it in maze as well, if that's adding to the kind of length in your dependency.
Yeah, I think that is a very good point. I think it probably is a good idea to do some like cross-methodological replication in this case, just to see if the effects are robust enough. And I mean, at least in this case, we don't really get delayed like expectations. I mean, another possibility is that this is kind of like a lexical prediction. You get automatic associations if you just long and mode. You get that and then it faded. Maybe when it's something that's syntactic, like argument structure, it can be stored longer in memory. So that can also be a difference, I think.
Yeah, that's how it's interesting to see how that would carry over into the theory, those differences between where the lexical prediction is really the strongest factor versus other factors.
Yeah. I mean, at this like kind of preliminary model, it's mostly about lexical predictions, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nikki Fackler from the University of North Carolina. I was just wondering, also kind of related to that last question about the methodology with the maze task, and if you think that the results where you didn't find the difference in the long condition would be the same if you had done like eye tracking, just because again the maze task is adding that additional time delay and also the cognitive load of having to make that decision at every step of the maze task that might sort of impact that effect. So I was just wondering what you would think if the data were collected with eye tracking.
Yeah, I mean, essentially this is a trade-off you have to consider as a researcher when you decide which experimental paradigm you want to use. I mean, eye tracking SPR is actually not supernatural either. Mm-hmm. I think the good thing is, this might be a bad way to frame this. You're more likely to get the effects you want when you use a maze. That's why one way to think of it is that it's less noisy. Like when things are, like SPR is just so noisy. You get even with eye tracking, you have to get to analyze so many regions. With eye tracking, you even need to analyze so many, how do you call it, eye movement measures. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you get some effects here, some effects there. You need to come up with some post hoc explanations for why that happened. I think that's why I think using image is slightly more parsimonious in that regard. And coming back to, whether it will actually influence how we interpret our results. Essentially, if you look at the short versus the long conditions, for the main effect of PMI, it might have a bigger impact. But essentially, our critical finding is the interaction. So, you're kind of comparing the short between short and the long between long, and then you see how much that differ with each other.
Do you think the interaction would be as strong with the eye tracking data, or maybe there would be some difference in that long condition?
I think you might still be able to find the effect, but the effect size won't be as strong for sure. Here, the slowdown or the delayed, what long distance condition does to you is about 100 milliseconds. I think it's kind of a very rare you can get that effect with SPR or eye tracking, maybe unless it's garden path sentences.
Okay, Thank you so much and great talk.
Thank you.
I'll keep my question short. Michelle Wong from Stanford. I guess I'm curious about the motivation of your noise term in your model. When you added each noise between each word, and then I guess this is more like a theoretical question about what accounts for an information unit, like a word or a chunk, or maybe a morpheme or a phoneme. So I guess what's your thought about?
Yeah, I think, this theory is very powerful. You can actually apply it at the level of morphemes, with number. There is a paper, I think, by Himanshu Yadav et al., 2023 or something. misremember the year, but you can essentially like put a noise term on the number, on the number morpheme of the subject and see how that will impact agreement computation. So I mean here we're because we're looking at the PMI between like one prior word and the current word. So we're just using estimating using the PMI between like two lexical units. Essentially, it is possible to model to use this model for like morphemes and other linguistic units. Yeah. Do you have another question? Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Another round of applause for Hailin, and then we will go to.